When he announced a 7-day ceasefire against some of Ukraine's civilian targets, Vladimir Putin wanted to project power. This was a ceasefire of Russia's choosing, and Putin would get all of the praise for it. But Putin is hiding something. Russia needs the ceasefire more than anything, as its army is collapsing so completely that Putin has resorted to sending the wounded back to war. When we say the wounded, we don't mean soldiers who have minor injuries from which they're still recovering. We're talking about soldiers who are so injured that they can't possibly serve any purpose other than being used as cannon fodder for Russia to throw against Ukraine's defenses. We're talking about amputees who are being sent back into Ukraine after losing arms or legs, and these unfortunate soldiers are being given no prosthetics and no support. This is desperation on the Kremlin's part, and it's indicative of Putin's callous nature and how much Russia's leader needs to get warm bodies, no matter what condition they are in, to Ukraine so he can project power that he doesn't have. But we'll get to all of that later in the video. On the amputee front, United 24 Media reported on January 30th that several Russian soldiers have come forward to share their stories of what serving in Putin's military really means. One of them, known only as Private Startsev, is a former prisoner who took the opportunity to head to Ukraine in 2024. There he lost his leg, only to find that there was no sympathy waiting for him back home. Startsev was patched up as best as a Russian hospital could manage before being given his new orders: go back to Ukraine. We've already paid our dues in blood, so what now? Are we supposed to die? Startsev raged in a video, explaining what had happened to him. The simple answer to that question is yes. Soldiers like Startsev are meant to die, and the angry survivor is far from the only amputee who Putin sent back into the firing line after they gave almost everything to their leader's invasion. United 24 Media reports that many of Russia's amputee soldiers were part of the 126th Motorized Rifle Regiment, and they were given their orders by a colonel named Konstantinov Volodymyr Mikhailovich. A callous colonel following orders from a brutal leader, perhaps, but still a colonel who seemed all too happy to send amputees back onto the front lines without prosthetics, as Startsev reveals. They were supposed to issue me with a prosthetic, but no one cares, the former prisoner claimed. And that criminal status may have influenced Mikhailovich's decision. According to Startsev, the colonels claimed that Russian soldiers who were convicts should all die, every last one. For those convict soldiers, fighting in Ukraine appeared to be an escape from Russia's prisons. Now, and as we'll explore later in the video, those same prisons may become the main escape for Russia's unwilling soldiers from quick deaths in Ukraine. For those who've been following Putin's shocking treatment of Russia's soldiers in Ukraine, Startsev's revelation won't be a surprise. The Russian private is far from the first to have come forward with stories of being sent to the front lines when they are in no condition to fight. There have been others, with some stories going back over a year. For example, December 6, 2024 saw the Moscow Times report on news from the Ostorozhno Novosty Telegram channel that wounded Russian soldiers were actively protesting being discharged from the hospital early so they could be sent back to the front lines. Alongside several videos purporting to show soldiers with broken limbs, some of whom were on crutches, the channel said, soldiers in need of treatment were sent to the combat zone in handcuffs from their units in the Krasnodar Krai. Those who refused to be sent were labeled refuseniks, though that isn't the story here. Sent back to the front lines in handcuffs reveals everything that you need to know. Even as far back as 2024, Putin was desperate to bleed every last drop of blood from those who'd signed up to fight his war. After all, a wounded soldier isn't much use to the Kremlin, but a dead one who soaked up a bullet or forced Ukraine to use a drone to kill them, that's cannon fodder that serves a use. A broken resource that has been maximized by the Kremlin, which is all that Putin cares about. The soldiers claimed that officers resorted to this measure after they refused to be sent to the combat zone and demanded that they complete the treatment that they had been previously prescribed, the Telegram channel adds, again highlighting just how little Russia actually cares about those who are fighting in Putin's war. The Moscow Times added its own little coda to this story. Russian officials claim that almost 98% of the country's wounded soldiers returned to combat. The Kremlin likely shared that statistic because it wanted to convince the world that the wounded soldiers were so lightly damaged by Ukraine's defenses that they always came back ready to fight. Amputees and those with broken bones being sent back to the front says otherwise. How many of the 98% who returned were actually ready or willing to fight? Russia will never reveal the answer to that question. There's a lot more where this came from, so if you're getting value from the military show, remember to subscribe for future videos that cover more revelations about the Russian army. And trust us, there is a lot more to this story. In January 2025, CNN shared a video that went a lot further than those provided by Ostorozhno Novosty, where the Telegram channel showcased Russian soldiers who were on the verge of being handcuffed and sent back to fight. CNN's video demonstrated that everything the channel said was true. It showed Russian soldiers hobbling along the battlefield on crutches, seemingly in a slow march toward assaults that they should never be a part of. One of those soldiers is observed on his own by a Ukrainian drone as he shuffles along on a single crutch, isolated, likely terrified. He is nothing more than a sitting target. The drone drops its explosive payload and the soldier dies. Both the New York Times and Novaya Gazeta have also carried similar stories about Russian soldiers being sent to the front lines when severely injured. And it gets worse than everything we've shared so far. Some of those soldiers aren't wounded. They're dying from diseases that make it clear that Putin is only using them as cannon fodder. Soldiers are sent to the front despite debilitating medical conditions like broken limbs, stage 4 cancer, epilepsy, severely damaged vision and hearing, head trauma, schizophrenia, and stroke complications, the New York Times said back in December. Novaya Gazeta explained that Russia has even started grouping soldiers with serious illnesses such as hepatitis and HIV into separate military units. Those soldiers have to wear armbands, which allow their comrades to figure out who they are. The same outlet notes that some Russian soldiers are catching so-called trench diseases, such as tuberculosis, due to their limited access to clean water. Of course, all of these ill soldiers suffer the same fate as the wounded and the amputees. They're sent to the front lines anyway. Just more cannon fodder to die for Putin's invasion. But here's the secret that Putin doesn't want you to know. Russia isn't hiring convicts to fight Putin's war because they're the best soldiers. It's certainly not sending the injured, ill, and those who are in no condition to fight ever again to the front lines because those people want to be there. Russia has these types of people on the front lines because it can't get anybody else. Putin is desperate, and the ceasefire proposal that we mentioned at the beginning of the video is a massive indicator that Russia's use of its wounded is a sign that it can't go on fighting the way that Putin wants it to fight for much longer. Let's talk about that ceasefire for a minute. On January 30th, reports started coming in that US President Donald Trump had claimed to have spoken to Putin. Trump reportedly extracted a promise from Putin. Russia would cease its attack on Kyiv and other Ukrainian settlements for 7 days, as Ukraine's people struggle with a lack of heating and electricity caused by Russia's constant strikes against the country's energy infrastructure. I personally asked President Putin not to fire into Kyiv and various towns for a week, and he agreed to do that, Trump declared. This is no act of charity by Putin, and it's certainly not an act of compassion. What Putin wants to achieve with this ceasefire, per Hamish de Bretton-Gordon in a January 30th piece for The Telegraph, is the pulling of the wool over Trump's eyes. Putin wants the praise for his move, despite having spent the entire winter ordering the bombardment of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, to the point that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been left without heat as temperatures fall to minus 15 degrees Celsius, or just 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Putin wants to give the impression that Russia is winning, that Russia can afford to stop its attacks because the fall of Ukraine is inevitable. However, de Bretton-Gordon says that this ceasefire is yet more of Putin's theatrics. This is not the gesture of a confident commander, it's the maneuver of a leader whose army is close to breaking, de Bretton-Gordon says. Using wounded troops as cannon fodder shows just how close Russia is to break. However, even the basic maths tells us that Russia's military can't keep up with Putin's war for much longer. De Bretton-Gordon says that Russia has suffered over 1.5 million casualties in Ukraine. The number is debatable. Ukraine itself says that Russia has suffered a little over 1.24 million casualties, which is an astonishing number for 4 years of fighting. Over the past 2 years, Russia has seized just over 1% of Ukrainian territory at the cost of more than 500,000 casualties, and continues to lose around 1,000 men a day. Since early 2024, Russian forces have advanced between 15 and 70 meters per day, a damning indictment of their tactics and leadership, de Bretton-Gordon writes. These are paltry gains in return for massive losses, and the injured are now being used as what de Bretton-Gordon dubs bullet catchers. Not solely because Putin doesn't care about them. He doesn't, and we'll dig into that in a moment, but Russia is sending its wounded and ill because it has nobody else to send. The Russian military has lost much of its combat power as actual soldiers and reservists have died in Ukraine. All that Putin has now are new recruits who barely know which way round their rifles go, and with that situation, sending the sick and injured is as good as sending able-bodied soldiers. They're all going to die anyway. The Kremlin has no answers for the brilliant defense that Ukraine is mounting. That's why Putin has called for a 7-day ceasefire. A move that is supposed to project power does anything but. Russia's president is trying to get a reward for his mercy. Putin wants to score points with Trump in the hope that the US will once again push Ukraine to cede territory. Russia isn't going to win that territory, not anytime soon at least. De Bretton-Gordon says that some analysts estimate that it will take another 1 million casualties and 4 more years of fighting to capture the various regions of Ukraine that Putin is demanding the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky see. But the reality, de Bretton-Gordon writes, is that the Russian army is approaching what he calls its culminating point. It's Ukraine that should be negotiating from a position of strength, he says, as the US is potentially indulging Putin's theatrics a little too much. Perhaps that's why Zelensky has been fairly muted in his own response to the ceasefire. Though Ukraine's president praised the efforts being made by the US to bring about peace, he also said that there was nothing official about the ceasefire, according to Politico on January 30. Zelensky may be indicating that performative Putin will break the ceasefire before it ends. But Putin may already be happy with the points he feels that he's scored as Russia approaches its breaking point. What we have here is a president who has complete disregard for his own people, which is why casualties on the scale we've seen have been allowed to happen in the first place, along with the sending of the sick and injured to the front lines. Russia's people may even have a chance to end the war that Putin started, especially as the specter of mobilization is looming over them due to Putin's desperation. Stick with us to the end of the video and we'll explain why. As Putin tries to point score, it's not just the ruined soldiers that he's sending back into the fight who are suffering. Even though both have come down somewhat during the past year, inflation and interest rates are crippling for the average Russian. According to the Moscow Times, Russia's Rosstat agency says that inflation slowed to 5.6% at the end of 2025, after hitting 9.5% in 2024. Russia's interest rate is now 16%, down from 21% in early 2025, but neither is as good a sign as Russia wants to claim. Assuming the figures are even accurate, they're both still extremely high, and they come off the back of figures that have caused serious damage to the average Russian's ability to pay for even the basic necessities that they need. And even amidst the economic nightmare, the Kremlin still spends every ruble it has on the war. Moscow pours what remains of its resources into missiles and drones to terrorize Kyiv rather than into looking after its own people. To the Kremlin, the Russian army is simply cannon fodder. Convicts and foreign recruits are worth even less, if that's possible, Debretton Gordon writes, and he's not wrong. The foreign recruits in particular are becoming a feature of a Russian military that is running out of Russians willing to die for Putin. Russia has already burned through some 15,000 North Korean soldiers. The Kremlin has even resorted to lying to people overseas in a desperate effort to trick them into the fight. Sadly, the deceit has worked against some. As France 24 reported in November, Russia has been using a shady recruitment network to lure young Indian men to Russia with the promise of jobs. You can already guess what happens to them. They end up in Ukraine as yet more cannon fodder. France 24 says at least 44 of its own people are now fighting in Ukraine, and several more have died in combat. The rest will likely follow unless they're able to get out. These overseas recruits are Russia's disposable soldiers, Medusa reported on January 22nd, and according to Danish Institute for International Studies researcher Karen Philippa Larsen, they're being recruited because Russia has a huge need for people to fight in this war. At least 20,000 third-country nationals have been signed up to fight in Ukraine, Medusa adds, in addition to 20,000 newly naturalized Russian citizens, many of whom likely end up trading their lives in exchange for that citizenship. This is the reality of the Russian army. Devoid of the veterans, reservists, and trained soldiers with which it started the war, that army is now filled with the ill, the injured, the deceived, and anybody else that the Kremlin can get its hands on to keep the numbers up, even as the assaults its new soldiers launch get destroyed constantly. And there's a reason that Putin is doing all of this. We hinted at it earlier in the video. Every soldier who shouldn't be fighting for Russia who is sent into, or in some cases back to, Ukraine is there because Putin absolutely needs to avoid the one thing that could end up being the tipping point for the support he has for his ill-fated invasion: mobilization. Russian deaths are only rising in Ukraine. United 24 media notes that Ukraine's new defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov reported that 35,000 of Russia's soldiers died or were badly injured in December 2025 alone. Fedorov has also set a target for Ukraine to bring that monthly bar up to 50,000 in 2026. For Putin, that scale of death is disastrous, even for a man who treats Russia's people like commodities. If it keeps up, it will certainly force mobilization if Putin wants to continue his war. Russia tried the mobilization tactic before. In September 2022, Putin partially mobilized, only to see a mass exodus of Russian citizens and an upswell in public discontent. These were warning shots from Putin's public. Mobilize again, especially to the scale that Russia now needs to rebuild anything even resembling a competent army, and discontent may evolve into rebellion. Putin's political standing is already shaky enough. He doesn't need to anger the Russian public more when they're dealing with the double blow of economic issues and their relatives dying in Ukraine in massive numbers. But the prospect of mobilization also represents an opportunity for Ukraine. Earlier we touched on how Putin has relied heavily on presenting fighting in Ukraine as a more attractive prospect than serving prison sentences to Russia's convicts. The opportunity, United 24 media says, is that if Putin is forced to mobilize, the situation is now different. Prison now looks like a better prospect than Ukraine. Russians could now look at Putin's desire to send them into the meat grinder of the Ukraine war and instead deliver a two-letter response: No. Russia does hand out harsh prison sentences for those who refuse to serve after being conscripted, the outlet points out. Around 17,000 to 18,000 Russian soldiers have been given 10-year prison sentences after going AWOL from their units. Those who say no before they go to Ukraine get sentences too, though they appear to be in the 2-year region. And even then, many of Russia's regional courts impose fines on those who refuse service, rather than prison sentences. One man, whom United 24 media dubs Kirill, has only paid the equivalent of $245 for refusing to serve after 4 or 5 hearings. These aren't terrible punishments. They're much better than being executed on the combat lines for refusing to charge or being sent into battle with missing limbs or serious illness. A few $100s lost or a couple of years spent in prison, even in a system as brutal as Russia's, is far preferable than fighting and dying in Ukraine. Perhaps that could be the impetus for the cannon fodder state that Putin is trying to create to push back against its president. Just say no. Mobilization would be dead in the water, as not even Putin can get away with imprisoning hundreds of thousands of Russians whom he would have to punish for refusing to fight. That would leave an already struggling Russia without the manpower resources that Putin needs to continue his war. After all, there are only so many amputees that Russia can send into the fight before that well runs dry. Speaking of resources, Russia is quickly discovering that it can't make use of the one resource keeping the Kremlin's war chest filled anywhere near as well as it once did. Russian oil isn't selling as it used to, and the US is the reason why. Find out how the US has cut off what Russia needs to keep waging its war without firing a single shot in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you for watching.